She said it was a relaxing trip with her besties. I tracked her location and booked the same flight back. I sat 2 rows behind her. With a surprise. The whole thing started 3 weeks ago when she came home from work looking more drained than usual. She'd been pulling long hours lately, and I could see the exhaustion in her shoulders, the way she'd collapse on the couch without even changing out of her work clothes. When she brought up the Miami trip, I actually felt relieved for her. She needed this break with her friends. They'd been planning it for months, she said, and I remembered her mentioning it before. A long weekend away from everything, just the girls reconnecting and unwinding. I even helped her pack, folding her favorite sundresses and making sure she had her good sunscreen. The night before she left, we ordered takeout and watched a movie together, and she seemed genuinely excited for the first time in weeks. The first day she was gone, I kept myself busy with projects around the house. Fixed the leaky faucet in the kitchen, reorganized the garage, caught up on some shows she hated. She texted me a few times, generic stuff about the weather being perfect and the hotel being nice. Nothing felt off about it. Then came day 2. I was scrolling through social media during my lunch break when I saw it. One of her friends had posted a story from what looked like a restaurant patio. There were drinks on the table, palm trees in the background, and in the corner of the frame, clear as day, was my wife. But she wasn't alone. Some guy was leaning into her, his lips pressed against her neck in a way that made my stomach drop. I stared at my phone screen for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Maybe it was innocent? Maybe it was just a weird angle? But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. She was wearing the blue dress I'd helped her pack. The one she'd been excited to wear because it was new and made her feel confident. I refreshed the story immediately, but it was gone. Completely vanished. My hands were shaking as I checked again and again, but there was nothing there. She'd untagged herself faster than I could process what I'd seen. The rest of that day passed in a blur. I couldn't concentrate on anything. Every normal task felt impossible. I kept picking up my phone to call her, then putting it down. What would I even say? I'd seen one blurry photo that lasted maybe 10 seconds. But that image was burned into my brain, the way he was touching her, the way she was letting him. That evening, she called me like nothing had happened. Her voice was bright and cheerful, telling me about the beach and how relaxing it was to just lie in the sun with the girls. I found myself analyzing every word, every pause, every inflection. When she said she was about to head to dinner with everyone, I almost asked where they were going. Almost. Instead, I did something I'd never done before in our relationship. After we hung up, I opened the Find My iPhone app. My hands were trembling as I waited for her location to load. When it did, my worst fears were confirmed. She wasn't at the hotel she'd told me about. She was across town at a completely different place. I spent the next hour on my laptop, cross-referencing the address with hotel websites and travel booking sites. The place she was actually staying was significantly more expensive than where she'd claimed to be. Not the kind of place you'd book for a casual girl's trip unless money was no object, or unless someone else was paying. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay in our bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation we'd had about the trip. Every detail she'd shared now felt like a carefully constructed lie. The hotel name, the restaurant recommendations her friend had supposedly made, even the flight times, how much of it was real. By morning, I'd made a decision that surprised even me. I called the airline and booked myself on her return flight. It took some doing. The flight was nearly full, and I had to pay extra for a last-minute booking. But I managed to get a seat just a few rows behind where she'd be sitting. I told myself I was being crazy. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe I'd misunderstood what I'd seen. But as I packed my own bag for the trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to discover something that would change everything. The flight to Miami felt endless. I kept imagining what I might find, what I might see. Part of me hoped I'd get there and realize I'd been paranoid, that she really was just having an innocent trip with friends. But the location data didn't lie, and neither did that photo I couldn't get out of my head. When I landed in Miami, I felt like I was in some kind of fever dream. I'd never done anything like this before, following my wife, spying on her, questioning her every word. But I also felt strangely calm, like I'd finally stopped lying to myself about what I'd been sensing for months. I didn't try to find her or confront her. Instead, I spent the day walking around the city, killing time until the flight home. I bought a coffee and sat in a park, watching families play with their kids, couples holding hands, normal people living normal lives. Everything felt surreal. Update 1. The airport was chaos when I arrived for our flight home. I checked in early and made my way to the gate, positioning myself where I could see everyone boarding without being obvious about it. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure other passengers could hear it. When she appeared, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. She wasn't alone. The man from the photo was right there beside her, pulling her carry-on bag, his hand casually resting on her lower back in a way that spoke of intimacy and familiarity. They were laughing about something, looking completely comfortable together, like they'd done this 100 times before. But what really destroyed me was seeing her face. She looked happier than I'd seen her in months. Relaxed and glowing in a way that made it clear this trip had been exactly what she needed, just not for the reasons she'd told me. I watched them board together, him letting her go first, that same protective gesture I used to make when we traveled. My seat was perfect for observing without being seen. I had a clear view of the back of her head, could see how she leaned into him as they settled in for the flight. For the first hour, I just watched her laugh at things he whispered in her ear. Watched her rest her head on his shoulder when she thought she might nap. Watched him stroke her hair in a way that was so gentle and familiar it made me want to scream. The flight attendants were making their rounds, offering drinks and snacks, when I realized I couldn't sit there any longer. I'd brought something with me, an envelope I'd prepared before leaving home, just in case. Inside were divorce papers I'd printed from a legal website. They weren't official yet, but they were real enough to make a point. I stood up, my legs shaky but my resolve firm. The walk down the aisle felt like it took forever. Other passengers looked up at me curiously as I passed, probably wondering why someone was walking around during the middle of the flight. When I reached their row, I stopped directly beside her seat. She looked up at me with confusion at first, then complete shock as recognition hit her. Her face went white, then red, then white again. I could see her trying to process how I could possibly be there, what it meant, what was about to happen. I handed her the envelope without saying a word at first. She took it automatically, her hand shaking as she realized what it was. The man beside her had gone completely still, like he was hoping to become invisible. That's when I spoke, loud enough for everyone in the surrounding rows to hear. I told her vacation was over. Simple as that. 3 words that encapsulated everything: the lies, the betrayal, the end of our marriage. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel dozens of eyes on us, passengers craning their necks to see what was happening. Flight attendants started moving toward us, clearly concerned about a potential disturbance. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something, but nothing came out. What could she say? There was no explanation that would make this okay, no excuse that would undo what I'd seen. I walked back to my seat without waiting for a response. The rest of the flight passed in a blur of whispered conversations and sideways glances from other passengers. I could see her shoulders shaking, could tell she was crying, but I felt nothing. The numbness was complete. Update 2. What I discovered after we landed changed everything I thought I knew about the situation. As we were deplaning, I noticed a woman waiting at the gate who looked agitated and kept checking her phone. She was holding a sign with a man's name on it, the same name I'd heard the flight attendant use when she'd offered him a drink. My wife and her companion were among the last to leave the plane. I hung back, pretending to organize my carry-on while keeping an eye on them. When they emerged into the gate area, the woman with the sign immediately started walking toward them. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. The woman wasn't just angry, she was devastated. She started talking rapidly, her voice getting louder with each word. From what I could piece together, she was his wife, and she'd been tracking his location just like I'd been tracking my wife's. It turned out this wasn't their first affair. She'd suspected something for months and had finally gotten proof. She'd driven to the airport to confront them both, having figured out their flight information the same way I had. The look on her face when she saw them together was heartbreaking, a mixture of confirmation and fresh pain. My wife looked absolutely stunned. She clearly had no idea he was married, had no idea there was another woman who'd been going through the same hell I'd been experiencing. The man tried to explain, tried to calm his wife down, but she wasn't having any of it. Airport security got involved when voices started rising. They separated everyone and moved us to a quieter area away from other passengers. It was there that the full scope of the situation became clear. His wife had been dealing with his infidelity for years. This wasn't just a fling, it was a pattern. He'd been having affairs regularly, always with women who thought they were in exclusive relationships with him. He told my wife he was divorced, had been free to pursue her without any complications. My wife kept looking at me, then at his wife, then back at me. I could see her trying to process that she'd been lied to just as much as I had. She wasn't just a cheater, She was also a victim of his deception. But here's what really got to me. As his wife was listing all the ways he'd betrayed her, all the lies he'd told, all the other women there had been, I realized something profound. My wife had been lying to me for months, but she'd also been lied to. She'd been manipulated by someone who made deception look effortless. The anger I'd been carrying started to shift into something more complicated. I was still furious about the betrayal, still hurt beyond words. But seeing her face as she realized how thoroughly she'd been played, seeing her understand that she'd destroyed our marriage for someone who'd never been honest with her for a single day, that was its own kind of justice. Airport security eventually asked us all to leave. His wife had said everything she needed to say, and my wife looked like she was about to collapse from the emotional weight of it all. We ended up walking to the parking garage in silence, each lost in our own thoughts about what had just happened. Final update. The drive home from the airport was the longest 45 minutes of my life. We took separate cars, mine from the long-term parking where I'd left it, hers from wherever she'd arranged to park before the trip. I kept checking my rearview mirror to see if she was following me, but her car disappeared into traffic after a few miles. When I got home, I went straight to our bedroom and started packing her things. I wasn't angry anymore, just exhausted. The betrayal still hurt, but the airport confrontation had drained all the fight out of me. I folded her clothes carefully, the same way I'd helped her pack for the trip that started all this mess. She arrived about an hour later. I heard her key in the lock, heard her footsteps on the stairs, but I didn't stop what I was doing. When she appeared in the bedroom doorway, she looked smaller somehow, like the events of the day had physically diminished her. She tried to explain, tried to apologize, tried to tell me how sorry she was and how she'd been lied to and how she never meant for any of this to happen. I listened without interrupting, but the words felt hollow. Intent didn't matter when the damage was already done. The conversation we had that night lasted until sunrise. She told me everything. How she'd met him at a work conference months ago, how he'd pursued her relentlessly, how he'd made her feel desired and appreciated in ways she'd forgotten were possible. She talked about feeling invisible in our marriage, about how we'd stopped really seeing each other somewhere along the way. Some of what she said was hard to hear because it was true. We had grown apart. We had stopped making effort with each other. We had let our relationship become routine and comfortable and ultimately forgettable. But none of that justified what she'd done, and I told her so. By the time the sun came up, we'd both said everything there was to say. The divorce papers I'd given her on the plane were just printouts from the internet, but we both knew they represented something real. Our marriage was over, and had been for longer than either of us had wanted to admit. She moved out that weekend. I helped her load her car, the same way I'd helped her pack for Miami. We were polite to each other, almost formal, like we were strangers who'd shared a house for a few years rather than a couple who'd promised to spend their lives together. The divorce process was surprisingly simple. We didn't have kids, didn't own much together, didn't fight over possessions or money. We just wanted it to be over quickly and quietly. By the time the paperwork was finalized, we hadn't spoken in months. I heard through mutual friends that she never saw him again after that day at the airport. His wife had apparently given him an ultimatum, counseling and complete transparency or divorce. He'd chosen to fight for his marriage, which meant cutting all contact with the women he'd been seeing. My wife had to face the reality that she'd blown up her life for someone who disappeared the moment things got complicated. She'd sacrificed everything for a fantasy, and now she was alone with the consequences. As for me, I spent the next few months rediscovering who I was without her. I fixed up the house, reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with, took up hobbies I'd abandoned. I learned to cook for one person, to sleep in the middle of the bed, to make decisions without consulting anyone else. The hardest part wasn't the loneliness or the practical adjustments of single life. It was letting go of the future we'd planned together. All those conversations about where we'd live when we retired, what we'd do with our time, how we'd grow old together, all of it had to be erased and replaced with something entirely different. But there was also something liberating about starting over. I realized I'd been settling for a relationship that wasn't making either of us happy. We'd been going through the motions for so long that we'd forgotten what it felt like to be genuinely excited about each other. The Miami trip had been her way of escaping a life that felt too small for her. The affair had been her attempt to recapture something she felt she'd lost. It was selfish and destructive, but it was also a desperate attempt to feel alive again. I couldn't forgive her, couldn't forget what she'd done, couldn't pretend our marriage was salvageable. But I could understand why she'd done it, and that understanding eventually replaced the anger that had been eating me alive. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I ran into her at a grocery store. We made awkward small talk for a few minutes, asking about work and family and all the safe topics divorced people discuss when they accidentally encounter each other in public. She looked different, older, maybe, or just tired. She asked if I was seeing anyone, and I told her the truth, that I was dating but taking things slow, that I wasn't ready to make any big commitments yet. She nodded like she understood, like she was in the same place. Before we parted ways, she apologized again. Not for the affair specifically, but for everything, for the lies, for the way our marriage had ended, for the pain we'd caused each other. It was the first apology that felt genuine, maybe because enough time had passed for both of us to see the situation clearly. I accepted her apology because holding on to resentment was exhausting. Not because I was ready to be friends or because I'd forgiven her completely, but because I was ready to let go of the bitterness that had been poisoning my ability to move forward. That night, I threw away the last box of her belongings that I'd been keeping in the garage. Old books, random keepsakes, things that had seemed too personal to give away but too painful to keep. It felt like closing a door that had been standing open for too long. The story could have ended differently if I'd never seen that social media post, if I'd never checked her location, if I'd never boarded that plane with divorce papers in my carry-on. We might have continued sleepwalking through our marriage for years, both of us increasingly unhappy but too comfortable to make a change. Instead, her betrayal forced us both to confront the truth about what our relationship had become. It was devastating and humiliating and publicly embarrassing, but it was also honest in a way we hadn't been with each other in years. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd handled things differently, if I'd confronted her privately instead of creating a scene on an airplane. But then I remember the look on her face when she realized how thoroughly she'd been deceived, how her affair partner had been lying to her just as much as she'd been lying to me. The public nature of the confrontation had been humiliating for both of us, but it had also been illuminating. We'd both been living in denial about different things, and sometimes it takes a dramatic moment to force people to see reality clearly. Now, 2 years later, I can honestly say I'm happier than I was in the final years of our marriage. Not because I wanted our relationship to end, but because I've learned the difference between being in a relationship and being in a good relationship. The woman I'm seeing now is nothing like my ex-wife, which is probably for the best. We communicate better, fight more fairly, and make time for each other in ways that feel intentional rather than obligatory. We're building something together instead of just maintaining something that already exists. I don't know if this new relationship will last forever, but I know it's healthier than what I had before. I know I'm more honest about my needs and more attentive to hers. I know I won't ignore warning signs or settle for comfortable indifference again. The Miami incident taught me that betrayal doesn't happen overnight. It's the result of hundreds of small disconnections, moments when couples choose convenience over intimacy, when they stop seeing each other as individuals worth pursuing. The affair was just the final symptom of problems that had been building for years. I'm grateful now for that social media post that started everything. Grateful for the friend who tagged my ex-wife and gave me the first clue that something was wrong. Grateful for the technology that let me track her location and book that flight. Grateful even for the pain of discovery, because it freed me from a situation that was slowly killing both of us. The divorce papers I handed her on that plane were supposed to be my moment of revenge, my way of exposing her betrayal and humiliating her in front of strangers. But they ended up being something else entirely, a gift to both of us. The gift of truth, the gift of consequence, the gift of being forced to face reality no matter how painful it was. She cheated during her girls' trip, and I surprised her with divorce papers mid-flight. But the real surprise was learning that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you is also the best thing. Sometimes you have to lose everything to realize what you actually want. Sometimes betrayal is just another word for liberation.